Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. Now, this week I am recording alone. GSP unfortunately could not join us. His schedule did not align for personal reasons, but I figured I'm going to keep things coming along. So it's going to be a shorter episode than usual. I do have a New York Times article to read you where the West functionally absolves itself from all responsibility for the Ukrainian situation and pins the blame on the incompetence of the Ukrainians. And don't worry, we will read through that. We'll get into further detail. I, of course, have plenty of news out of Europe, a little bit out of the Asia Pacific, plenty out of the Middle East, particularly with the standoff with Iran right now. But for starters, as always, I'm going to do a brief frontline update. It's not going to be as thorough or comprehensive as they usually are. The somewhat last minute changes did change the structure of the show, so I was only able to put together some brief battlefield reports, but we'll get right into those. So, what we have for you first is the Pokrovsk direction. And the current actions are indicated by these little dots right now. I am using Syriac Maps, which is made publicly available as a Google Maps filter. Great Telegram channel, daily updates on this. But for the sake of brevity, right here in the Pokrovsk direction, unfortunately, I couldn't get close enough to get the city name, or the outskirt name, I should say. But the outskirt closest in that red orange dot closest to Pokrovsk, to the west of it, if you're looking at this on the screen right now, uh, slightly down and to the left, there are clashes in Zvirovne, and then there's also current clashes right next to that other reddish orange one in Kotline village. Clashes for Constantinople, I'm sorry that name kills me every time, do continue, as well as the fights for Razliv and also Bogdanovka. So the Pokrovsk direction, which I still maintain is going to be the next pivotal battle of the war. You're getting these positional fightings right now in the outskirts of Pokrovsk, which at this point is one of the last fortress cities, if not the last fortress city, depending on how you wanted to find it, and also a major logistics hub. More or less the last thing standing in between between Russian forces and a drive to the Dnieper, which is a speculation going on right now. I'll get into all of the diplomatic speculation, the so-called peace talks, a little later once we get past this frontline news. But we are shaping up in the next few months, at least I believe, for a battle of Pokrovsk proper. And this is one of the most fortified places left on the Ukrainian line, so it is going to take quite a bit of preparation for the Russians. Some have said they've been dragging their heels in this sector. I'm not inclined to disagree with that. However, this is going to be a major undertaking, and as I've said in previous episodes, as I will continue to repeat, this is going to be as consequential as Bakhmut and as consequential as Avdiivka. Because once we actually see the Battle of Pokrovsk proper, I think we will have a much clearer vision of how much longer this war is going to last and what direction this war is going to take, both on the battlefield and both in terms of international attention. And that Ukraine's conventional military strength being put to the test, Ukraine's conventional military logistics being put to the test before they have to resort to what one could say more asymmetric fighting, similar to some of the things we have seen in Kursk and the ongoing Belgorod attempt at an offensive. This is going to be the defining battle, I think, conventionally of the war, at least for this year. I was expecting this much sooner. I thought it was going to happen before the end of 2024. I was proven wrong with that. The Kursk direction has proven to be much more active, and like I said, we'll get into that. But with all that being said, I will move on to some news out of Toretsk. So moving on to Toretsk, we see probably the most conventional Ukrainian success in several months. Now, I'm not saying this is by any means a great counteroffensive or something that is going to set the Russians back, But the Ukrainians in this sector have dug in. They have proven that they still have fight in them, and that they can still resist. And even as casualties mount, and even as broader international support falters, I'm not saying that in a material sense because of course it's coming, but the constant back and forth rhetoric coming out of Washington, coming out even out of some of the other European capitals, and the general disunity in the Western support for the Ukrainian war effort, one would think it would lead to a greater deal of demoralization. However, as you see, particularly in this sector, the Ukrainians are digging in, and as has been speculated before, which I still maintain, is that many of the troops that were funneled out of Kursk end of last year, beginning of this year, were redirected to this front in order to slow the Russian advance. Because at this point, anyone who's honest with the situation realizes that barring some black swan event, the Russian advance is inevitable as long as this war goes on. But if they can slow it, if they can inflict more casualties on the Russians, that's really the Ukrainian strategy and the broader Western strategy at this point, is just slowing the bleed and taking down, I suppose you could say, as many Russians as they can with them. But the main activity on this front over the past couple days in Sherebanivka, which is this orange dot right here in the blue on the southwest of the map, the Ukrainians have managed to repel Russian offensive towards the settlement. You also have the Russians advancing towards Krimskoye or Krimske on this map right here, in about the center of the map that you're looking at right now. And probably the most intense fighting, or at least the most consequential fighting, is this salient right here next to Sensueli Rinok, which that's the marker for the grocery store. But if you go up a little further, in this western part of Toretsk, in this western outskirt of the city, or western part of the city, I should say, that is where the clashes do continue. Neither side has made much headway, but that's where the main activity on the Toretsk front is taking place right now. And I will now go over to Kursk and Belgorod to give a broader situation of the war being brought to Russian soil and the repulsion of that war, and also potential action in Sumy and other parts of the front, and the potential ramifications of the Ukrainian operations in Kursk. So I'll go ahead and pull that up. So, what is happening on the remainder of the Kursk front? Aside from the incursions that you see into Sumy, into Basilka, you also have fighting from the Ukrainians using the force cover to their advantage as they're being pushed back. Uh, Somewhat of an asymmetrical fight going on in Oleshnia, and also in Guevo is the main direction which the Russians are pushing right now. You'll see that right there. It's the orange dot right where the Ukrainian and Russian controlled territories meet on the map. It's in generally the center of the map. If you go down a little bit to the south, that is where the main direction of fighting on the Kursk proper front is right now. And the Ukrainians continue to get pushed back in Kursk. And if you are to believe Russian reports, which I think should be taken with a grain of salt, certainly, then for the total of the Kursk offensive, the estimation from the Russian side, so like I said, take it with a grain of salt, is that the enemy lost around 71,000 troops, 402 tanks, 327 infantry fighting vehicles, 290 armored personnel carriers, 2,233 armored combat vehicles, 589 artillery guns, and 53 multiple rocket launchers. Now, in retaliation for the Russian counteroffensives in Kursk, for the Russian advances in Kursk, the Ukrainians have continued strikes with HIMARS against targets, particularly against the energy infrastructure in Suja, completely disregarding whatever hope there was for a ceasefire when it came to energy infrastructure. So, what the Ukrainians have in terms of supplies right now, they are using in, once again, what seems like, in my opinion at least, a very asymmetrical effort in order to slow the Russians, in order to inconvenience the Russians both economically and strategically, rather than a more conventional war effort that, say, you would have seen in the 2023 counteroffensive. And finally, the biggest update for my brief frontline news is the ongoing action in Belgorod. So, the two areas that are the focus for this Ukrainian incursion are Popovka, which is to the left of the map, the orange dot, and Demidovka, which are bordering villages that fall on the Russian side. And over the past week, they have changed hands. The fighting is still quite pitched for that. However, what you see right now is really more of the same from the Ukrainians. We've seen them try to push into Belgorod multiple times since, I believe, November, December 2022. And every time it is to little to no avail. And what we get, and some of the stories out of Kursk also match some of the stories out of Belgorod, is just wanton slaughter. Some of the atrocities that the Russians have claimed they found evidence of in Kursk, which I won't get too much in the details because I'm waiting for the dust to settle, but I will say it involved the death of under 18s is what the Russians are claiming, and they have, in my opinion, some pretty compelling evidence that I can't show on here because of just the what you're allowed to show on YouTube. I don't think I could put it on there, but you can go on to Twitter, Telegram, any of these sources, and you'll be able to find at your own peril if you want to see some of the things that have been going on, particularly on the Kursk front and in Belgorod. I could direct you there, but as for what I can show on air, it is practically nothing. But these do continue. However, one of the speculations, which I do agree with, one of the analysis of the current Ukrainian offensive, or the current Ukrainian incursion, if you will, into Belgorod, is that it is tying up Russians who were pushing into Sumy from the Kursk direction, which brings me back to my one of my original theories for the Kursk offensive, and I will restate that in large part, on top of garnering Western support, particularly for the long-range missiles, access to those, and on top of the possibility of capturing the power plant for negotiations, I believe the Ukrainians launched the Kursk offensive in order to delay a potential offensive against Sumy. And I believe what we're seeing right now is a very similar move, but on a much smaller scale, where the Ukrainians are applying pressure on this part of the front line into Russia proper to stave off another Russian offensive. Because the big talk now is Russia gearing up for another offensive? You've seen that from both people speculating on the Ukrainian side, you've seen that from people speculating on the Russian side, because the Ukrainians are on the ropes, really, and that much of their practical fighting capability has been degraded. People are speculating now is going to be the time for another Russian offensive, which plays into the talk about the negotiations. While the Russians, yes, are on the surface cooperative with the West, and I'll get, like I said, more into the details of the nitty gritty of what's happening in Saudi Arabia, the talks between Trump and Putin, Trump's comments about Putin this week, is the question, are the Russians going to press the advantage? Are they going to take advantage of the Ukrainians in this much weakened state and continue the offensive, especially when, as I had mentioned before, Western unity is really at an all-time low when it comes to the situation, when it comes to the Ukrainian situation. When Trump's loyalties are split, you could say, when he seems to be taking a very transactional view towards the conflict in Ukraine. Think about the mineral deal, what he's demanding from Zelensky, the quote-unquote repaying of debt. And some might say it would be the prime opportunity for the Russians to go on the offensive. Now, I'm not going to sign on 100% to this next piece of analysis, but something I've seen floated that I do think is worth discussing is that the Russians could be pursuing a style of negotiation similar to the peace talks surrounding Vietnam, where there was active combat while the parties were meeting in Paris for the Vietnam talks, and that the Russians could be continuing these talks for the sake of formality, seeing what they can get from the U.S. outside of Ukraine itself in terms of normalization, seeing what terms they could get the U.S. to agree to, while also continuing the offensive, where it's very good PR, especially for the countries that are, I guess you could say, neutral in this war, the countries that haven't really condemned Russia, but aren't BRICS countries, not outright supportive of Russia, or not showing any particular sympathy towards the Russians. I suppose you could say it's for them to show that they're a reasonable party, to show that they are willing to talk, but they're not going to lay down arms. They're not going to freeze the conflict. They're not going to give the West the time to rebuild Ukraine's military capacity to the extent that they can during some sort of ceasefire, because that's been the constant man from Trump: ceasefire, 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 and it's simply not going to happen. You thought you were going to get the 38-day ceasefire, at least in terms of energy infrastructure, but the Ukrainians wouldn't honor that. So it has been a back and forth. And like I said, I think the entire Russian approach to negotiations is formality for public appearance. But before I get too much into the question of negotiation, NATO, Trump, etc., I did want to take a moment to talk about some interesting data, I suppose you could call it, about drone warfare in Ukraine. And the Military Medical Journal reports that more than 75% of the casualties in the trench warfare in Ukraine are being caused by drones. They claim 75.5% of injuries were caused by FPV drone drops and hits, 20.5% injuries were caused by artillery ammunition, and only 4% were received from small arm fire. Now, if you want to go with the World War I analog, which a lot of people do because of the very slow incremental trench warfare, I think it's a fair comparison, not a one for one, but I think it's generally a fair comparison. Most of the casualties during World War I were from artillery fire. They were not from small arms, they were not from engagements directly. And I think that tracks, especially some of the drone videos we've seen, that the majority of casualties, both in terms of fatalities and injuries, are going to be from drones. And just for reference, they took this from a sample of about 5,800 Russian personnel in order to gain these figures. So the Ukrainian figures may be more damning, I guess you could say. But to continue on some of the other information that was revealed in this article, was the majority of the injuries, about 58%, were to the extremities, and they were classified about 73% as minor injuries. And that about 56.5% of those injured are considered lightly wounded and are able to return to duty without leaving the military area after receiving medical care, and that only about a quarter of injuries are sent to the rear for further treatment. So, we've always made an effort to talk about the innovations of this war, and particularly some of the more brutal sides, such as the drone warfare and like snipers in World War II, or like pilots in Vietnam. Every war has its, I guess you could say, most hated personnel by the enemy side, where if those are the people who are captured, they are not going to be spared. And the comparison that always gets thrown around, which once again I think is fair, is the snipers. When the enemies get their hands on a sniper, it is usually torture and execution. And as we've seen with drone operators on both sides, it usually is torture and execution. And I'm not going to condone that from either side, but these are going to be the people who are the object of rage, because this is the new deadly form of warfare. This is the new level of depravity that things have been taken to. So while once again I can't condone what's happened, to fault these people in the heat of the moment is kind of hard, all things considered. But moving on to broader news from Ukraine, this comes from a report from The Economist about the Ukrainian emigration crisis, and that Ukrainian refugees may remain in Europe forever, as The Economist tells us. And this is something we've also been saying on this program for a long time, that many of these displaced Ukrainians, whether they go to other countries in Europe, to North America, or the elephant in the room, Russia, many of them went to Russia, that these people have no incentive to return home because Ukraine is going to be a black hole. The country is devastated, it's destroyed, it's economically insolvent. There is going to be no opportunity left there. And one of the things that The Economist notes is that with the growing prospect of a ceasefire or some sort of at least pause in hostilities, now I don't believe that's the case, but that's the general perception that's been going around with Trump's public facing agenda, at least, is they fear once some degree of demilitarization takes place, once some degree of detente between the two sides, I suppose for lack of a better word, takes place, that if you get a situation where martial law ends in Ukraine, a lot of these young men, men ages, I believe, 18 to 45, were the ones restricted from leaving the country. That many of them will try to get out of the country as soon as possible. Number one, because they don't want to be caught up in another draft crisis if the hostilities resume. Number two, there's simply no opportunity left in this country. Uh, we're already talking about in Poland, about 2/3 of the Ukrainian refugees are already working or trying to join the workforce, and that the government is exchanging temporary protection in pathway to a residence permit. So Poland is integrating these people. As we see in Europe, there is labor shortages. They do need migrant workers, and while of course Poland does have its own problem with quote unquote legal migration, a lot more of these countries, especially on who are more immigration skeptic, look at these Ukrainians sometimes, not all in all cases, sometimes look at these Ukrainians and think that they are a good enough substitute for, say, migration from parts of Africa, the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, etc. But we will continue to see people leave Ukraine because there will be no economic opportunity, especially if the EU opens up its doors to Ukraine. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be EU membership. I think that is completely off the table. Ukraine is so driven into the ground economically, it would take decades, if even, for them to be even able to get into the EU by its own rules. Now, will the EU bend its rules for political expediency or to make a point? Possibly. But you're also asking, say, the frugal four or just the generally productive nations of Europe to take on another burden. And even the net takers of the European Union, some of these countries in Central and Eastern Europe, think Poland, think Romania, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary, etc., etc., etc. Now, Hungary, for its own reasons, is completely ruled out European Union membership for the time being, especially based on the minority rights of ethnic Hungarians, among others, in Ukraine. But a lot of these countries that are net takers are not going to want somebody else who is going to be competing for the same funds that they are. It is not in their interest. And as we've seen since before the start of this war, but especially since the start of this war, where particularly those working in the agriculture sectors in the aforementioned countries have said absolutely not to Ukrainian grain imports because it floods their markets, it puts them out of work. So while there might be a greater geostrategic reason, while there might be existing ethnic and historical grievances, when it comes down to practicality, these countries are not exactly friends of Ukraine, nor do they desire to see further Ukrainian integration into the European Union. It benefits no one. I guess you could say for Trump it's a good out because now the Europeans are stuck with the bill for rebuilding Ukraine. But I simply don't see that happening. And I mean NATO membership, that's not happening. There's no way you can give security guarantees to whatever's left of Ukraine. Nobody's going to want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. I mean, no pun intended, but even the Poles have the reservations about that. Trump has definitively said no. Uh, Orban, the Hungarians have. Turkey still stands strong by the point that it will not allow Ukrainian NATO membership. The Germans and the Italians have gotten cold feet about it. Even Merz hasn't gone as far as to make Ukraine in NATO comments. Of course, Starmer would support it. He's the one trying to put together the coalition of the shilling, I suppose you could call it. Macron waffles back and forth. That's his so-called strategic ambiguity, I guess. But there's simply not the consensus in NATO in order to get Ukraine into NATO. And it's not going to happen. It's not going to get into the EU. And that once this war ends, this war will more than likely, barring some major black swan event, will end in Russia's favor. The remainder of Ukraine will simply be a black hole. And honestly, with some of the reconstruction plans, especially getting into Trump's antics regarding the mineral deal, regarding all of that, it might be preferable for the Ukrainians just to capitulate and have everything from Lvov to Donetsk become part of Russia. Now, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think anything close that's going to happen. But sometimes it looks like it would be a more preferable option for the Ukrainians. And this is what they've fought so bitterly to avoid. And I will bring up the question once again, given the sorry state of Ukraine. What peace terms could the Russians have imposed, or what demands could the Russians have imposed on Ukraine that would have been worth fighting to the absolute ruination of a country? We're talking about some of the lowest birth rates in Europe, some of the lowest birth rates in the world. And I'm not particularly one who's a demographic alarmist on that kind of thing. I think countries can survive low birth rates. I think they can recover from them. But Ukraine is in what many people have said, what I will agree, is a death spiral. Okay, people aren't being born, people are leaving the country, people are unable to find work, infrastructure is crumbling. Even before the war, infrastructure was crumbling. Systemic corruption within the state, and this is beyond just regular post-Soviet corruption. A lot of countries have just regular post-Soviet corruption. Look at Russia itself. It's a much more functional state than it used to be, but it still does have those pitfalls. Let's be honest about the situation here. Um, Central Asian countries do. Moldova, don't even get me started on Moldova. The Baltic states on paper don't, but if anyone is honestly assessing the situation, they do. They all do. But Ukraine has worked itself into such a profound level of corruption and dysfunction, especially post Maidan, the quote unquote anti corruption protests. There's simply no way out of this. This country will continue to be a black hole, and nobody's going to want to take up the financial burden of rebuilding it. And as far as Russia's concerned, they're already stuck with enough of a bill from the damage that's been done during this war. Because you look at the areas that are under Russian occupation, aside from Mariupol, which in many ways is a PR stunt. I'm not denying that there's been real progress there. There has been real progress there. But it has been the poster city for the reintegrated territories, for the annexed territories. Not every city is going to be Mariupol. Not every city is going to be the port vacation city. You're going to have a lot of these places that are probably going to become ghost towns. A lot of these places that are probably going to remain piles of rubble because nobody wants to go back, because the people who live there have either resettled to one side or another. And these are dilapidated industrial towns, in which case you've seen, while it's far from the same circumstances, in the abstract, you've seen places like Bulgaria where ghost towns just crop up because of the lack of population growth, both due to low birth rates and emigration, which has been really the deadly combination for a lot of these Eastern European former communist bloc countries. And while I don't think Russia meets that definition by any stretch of the imagination, especially compared to the other ones, you are probably going to get a lot of these parts of Ukraine that are going to be depopulated in both the Russian-controlled territories and in both the territories left outside of Russian control. And, hey, if Ukraine gets in the EU, like I said, it gives the people free passage out. And as we know with EU migration policy, or these EU-affiliated countries' migration policies, it's going to be a hodgepodge of everyone in the world who wants to come live within proximity of Europe. Of course, Ukraine is in Europe, but within proximity of political Europe, I suppose we can call it, the entity of the EU. And at that point, the corrupt government will probably be so desperate for people they'll take anyone from Central Asia, South Asia, Middle East, Africa, etc., etc., etc. And people say this like it's a joke, and this was somewhat of a joke uh, before the war started and during the war, the early days of the war, that is, that Ukraine's fighting so they can import infinity immigrants. And that might actually end up being the case if things continue along the current trajectory. And I mean, I can keep rambling on about this, but in terms of reconstruction costs, Ukraine is not going to get it. The countries that could afford to rebuild Ukraine are simply not interested. And I did touch on this somewhat with the Russian annexed territories, where the Russians themselves, they're going to have some funds, but they're not going to be able to undertake the level of reconstruction that will be necessary. They could court investment from China, maybe from the oil-rich Gulf states, maybe from other BRICS nations. I mean, India, you can laugh and scoff. There's a lot you can criticize about India, but they have a very productive economy. They have a growing economy, and they have money to invest. So you could see a situation where some of the BRIC states or the Gulf states or any nation that has been on cooperative terms with Russia who wants to reap the benefits of investment could buy into this. They could buy into reconstruction of Russian controlled southeastern Ukraine. Ukraine proper is not going to get that treatment. Nobody's going to want to touch this. For the time being, you have Donald Trump in office, who is, at least for political reasons, taking a very transactional stance towards Ukraine, where they're going to sign the mineral deal, which Zelensky has still waffled back and forth on signing, where it's going to start as repayment to us and then go into a quote unquote investment fund for Ukraine that, let's be honest, a dime is probably never going to make it to Ukraine for any sort of reinvestment. You have the Europeans, which are grappling with their own financial crisis. I don't see why the Gulf states would be interested in investing in rump state Ukraine, or why China would be interested in investing in rump state Ukraine, especially when these countries are on, at the very least, working terms with the Russians. There's just simply nothing there. And I don't think the Russians are going to invest in a sovereign Ukraine, barring situations that say Odessa remains part of rump state Ukraine. The Russians are going to invest in the ports there. They're going to have their economic, cultural, and political ties there because Odessa is simply too valuable not to have a finger in that pie, for lack of better expression. But I suppose with all that being said, we should move on to some of Trump's statements and onto the more diplomatic side. Now, as I said previously, Trump has completely snubbed the idea of Ukraine joining NATO. That is just out of the question. But now, to refer back to The Economist, they are reporting that presidential elections in Ukraine may be held in July. And they cited a quote unquote anonymous source within the Ukrainian government, and that Zelensky is planning on springing a surprise election on all of his competitors by launching his campaign in the middle of the summer. And he allegedly instructed his office to begin preparations for said election. Now, I will believe it when I see it, barring significant amount of pressures not only from the United States but also the West as a whole, because we've seen this with the constant back and forth with Ukraine. When Trump publicly takes a more skeptical position, the Europeans close ranks and they make guarantees to Zelensky, and Zelensky takes them as if they were the equivalent of the kind of guarantees the Americans could give him, when they're not. It's just simply not the case. So it would take a collective effort of the entirety of NATO, or the majority of NATO, saying there needs to be new elections held, uh, need to negotiate with Russia, blah, 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 and Zelensky needs to renew his mandate if he wishes to continue leading Ukraine. And that would probably be coupled with some sort of proposal for a ceasefire in order to conduct those elections. But moving on to some of the broader diplomatic news between the U.S. and Russia before I get into this Very fun New York Times article. That should be quite the read. It might drag on a little, but trust me, I think it's worth it because it's very telling. Where they can't come out and tell you everything that people who've been honestly following this war could have told you since before February of 2022. But last Monday's talks between the U.S. and Russia in Saudi Arabia seemed very fruitful on the surface, but we'll see what actually happens when it plays out. Now, according to Lavrov's summary, some of the key takeaways is that Russia cannot take Ukraine's word. Russia is going to need clear guarantees for the resumption of Black Sea trade, which can only be result from an order from Washington to Zelensky. The talks in Riyadh are focused primarily on safe navigation of the Black Sea. The presidents of the Russian Federation and the United States are currently being briefed on the situation of U.S.-Russia talks. Moscow is in favor of resuming a Black Sea initiative in the form more acceptable to all. The U.S. has heard the Russians signal on guarantees and understands that it can only be achieved through a positive result through stopping terrorist attacks and Ukraine's aggression. Lavrov's words, just to clarify again. And Russia at the meeting with the U.S. and Riyadh demanded that there be no ambiguities when it comes to a renewal of the Black Sea Initiative or return to the so-called grain deal. And what we have seen is that Trump is using this, or Trump's team is trying to use this as a jumping off point for a broader ceasefire. We saw this with the attempt at the energy ceasefire, and we see this attempt to return to the Black Sea trade, which what's coming mostly out of the Black Sea is oil shipments and grain shipments. But those have been hampered ever since the Black Sea agreements fell through much earlier in the war. And I think at this point, when it comes to Ukraine, Trump is very adamant about this. He's very adamant about getting this because it's going to prove his chops as a negotiator in a world that is radically different from when he first assumed office 8 years ago, and also even from when he left office about 4 years ago when Brandon took over. And Trump, in general, I don't think this is a unique statement, wants a quick end to Ukraine. He wants to be able to shelve this issue, particularly with the growing tension in the Middle East and also the impending, I guess you could say, showdown with China. I don't want to say war. I don't want to say confrontation because I think that implies a much more direct engagement with China than what we're looking at. But when it comes to the so-called pivot to Asia that we keep hearing on and on about, that Trump needs a clean break on the Ukraine issue in order to focus on that. But their issue is he really can't afford to take a diplomatic loss. He can't afford to be left with egg on his face, or what he might perceive for egg on his face, nor to anger some of his backers who are adamant on the Ukraine issue. Not all of them, but some of them are. And also to stave off, of course, the Russian collusion allegations. And in order to smooth over U.S. European relations, because Trump has been bombastic, Trump has been very provocative. But as we were saying in the previous episode, the amount of trade that still goes on between Europe and the U.S., the amount of money tied up in each other's economies, the transatlantic alliance still exists economically. They are still intertwined with vital interests. So you're not going to get that kind of break from Europe that I think Trump would ideally want. But given the reality on the ground, it is simply not happening. Now, Trump, when continuing with his policy towards Russia, said that he was quote unquote pissed off at Putin and that the relationship is at the lowest it ever been. Now, he did try to backpedal those statements later, but those were particularly over the claims of the Russian government of Putin, coming from Peskov, Zakharova, once again, all of Putin's people, about the claims that Zelensky is illegitimate because his term is expired. And Trump has taken a great deal of offense to this, at least publicly, in saying that he was really pissed with Putin, that he would dare call Zelensky illegitimate, and that they're supposed to be working towards peace together. And to go back to my previous point, Trump is really just trying to ramrod some sort of peace here, ramrod some sort of ceasefire, so he can wash his hands of the situation and focus on other crises, as it were. But the threat he made in order to bring Putin to the table, in order to get him to get back in line, was threatening secondary sanctions and tariffs for countries trading in Russian oil. So that be China, India, Iran, which is already sanctioned all hell. Even the Gulf states, Egypt, Venezuela certainly, once again already sanctioned the hell. And just a number of nations, even plenty of nations in Europe. It's simply not possible. The amount of sanctions he would have to implement. Now, maybe this is part of his tariffs on everybody global policy that's going to be taking place this week. But I don't think it's a serious threat. It's something that he's just talking out of both sides of his mouth here. Because Trump has two levers when it comes to negotiating with Russia and Ukraine: threaten more sanctions and threaten to hamstring the aid to Ukraine or try to get the Ukrainians to sign on to some sort of lopsided deal. Because the reality of the situation is the U.S. does not have much leverage to work with when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. And there's not much they can do to bring either side to the table in a meaningful sense. Of course, there's much more they can do to bring the Ukrainians to the table, but American leverage over Russia at this point is practically non-existent. They can jangle the keys of economic reintegration with the West, opening back up European and American markets. But we've seen since 2022, the Russians have managed to make up, in fact, exceed their losses in the non-European markets. And the only people who are suffering from this are the Europeans. And perhaps that's Trump's goal. Perhaps Trump wants to, number one, weaken the Europeans as a potential rival power bloc, which I think the concept of that is absurd in and of itself. And what I said previously in previous episodes is Trump does need to keep that divorce, that enmity between the Europeans and the Russians. If his broader global strategy, or at least what he purports for his broader global strategy, is going to continue, that any sort of reconciliation, any sort of mutual understanding between Europe and Russia is simply a non-starter. That there has to be a divide, there has to be a chasm between the two. And he's also working on similar efforts in order to make that happen. A similar chasm with Russia and China, Russia and Iran, Iran, China, the Gulf states, China, etc. He's trying to break up these partnerships. I'm not going to say alliances because I think that implies a stronger level of cooperation than what's there. But he's trying to break up a lot of these partnerships that developed over the course of the Biden administration. In fact, even going back a little further in some cases. For about the past decade, these machinations that have been taking place. And he's trying to break them up. Except he is trying to go about in a way that assumes American power is what it was in 2015. And even 2015, we were starting to see our power decline. But Trump is, particularly with the tariffs, you see this when it comes to his threats not only towards so-called rival blocs like the Chinese, the Russians, BRICS, etc., but towards his own allies, trying to extract concessions from the Canadians, trying to extract concessions from the Europeans. And he's operating under the mindset that American economic power is far greater than it is, because a lot of America's influence, while it still is a very powerful, arguably still the most powerful country in the world, very influential, still has a great deal of military and economic reach, it declines a little bit year by year. And it doesn't seem like they are able to recover those losses. And I do think that's the case. And what Trump wants to do right now is he wants to assert that America is still the axis on which the world revolves. And that does necessarily mean breaking up these burgeoning partnerships, these burgeoning alliances, and pitting them against each other, which, by process of elimination, places the Americans on top of the economic totem pole. Not that they aren't already, but it secures a more comfortable position for them if they can force their enemies to infight. Except the American empire, particularly since the end of the Cold War, has pushed the envelope further and further, and they have forged very strong partnerships based on a mutual opposition to American overreach. That is why you're not going to see the fissure between Russia and China. That's why you're not never going. I shouldn't say never, but that's why for the foreseeable future you're not going to see another Sino-Russian split. You're not going to see the Russians throw the Iranians under the bus for the sake of a peace deal with the West. I mean, just look at the geography of it. The Iranians, militarily speaking, are Russia's southern flank, and they have a great deal of military cooperation. In fact, Trump's inauguration day, they signed treaties to deepen security ties. And number two, when it comes to trade, they're part of a southern corridor where goods are shipped through the Caspian Sea, end up in Iranian ports in the north, and then are shipped out from Iran to an international market, whether that be to India, whether that be to places in East Asia or Africa. Iran is simply too vital on the Russian chessboard for them to just throw it away in the vague hopes of some sort of reconciliation with the United States or for pleasing Trump by letting him have at the Iranians. It's simply not going to happen. So continuing on with European news, probably the biggest story we have this week that came out as of the recording day, which is right now, 31st of March 2025, is that Le Pen was arrested on so-called embezzlement charges for the abuse of EU funds and was given a 5-year sentence from being barred from political activity, as well as 4 years in prison, 2 years suspended, and the other two under what is, to my understanding, effectively a house arrest. Now, this is the third case of a NATO country, the first two being Romania and Turkey, of the outright suppression of the opposition. Once again, I'm not some big lover of democracy. I'm not here to defend the principles of electoral politics in and of itself. Nor do I even necessarily trust Le Pen as a quote unquote anti establishment or quote unquote populist figure. In many ways, she reminds me of Maloney, somebody vying for power, somebody who would get in there and drive a dagger in the back of her closest supporters. Now, I think compared to, say, somebody like Maloney or some of these other sellouts, she's been a bit more resolute. Maybe it wouldn't be quite to that extent, but I do think the comparison that she would be one of these turncoats is not unfounded, considering the fact that even recently her statements about particularly Ukraine and NATO started to waffle. She had a quote unquote disconnect from Trump on the issue, where before she was rather adamant about Europe not getting embroiled in this war, Europe not drawing swords against Russia, and that it would be destructive. But, of course, this is the situation we find ourselves in right now, and it's going to be a trend, especially after Vance really fired a shot across the bow with his Munich speech. Given the current feuds between the U.S. and the EU, I think it's going to inflame tensions where a lot of quote unquote far right candidates are going to find themselves under the legal microscope. And you even have Mertz making similar pledges that he's going to look into the so called influence of the AFD and what connections they have, what extremist connections they have, what foreign connections they have, in order to suppress them as well. And they have been a target of the German legal system previously, but I think that's only going to continue with some of the policies that Merz pursues when he comes to the office of Chancellor. Italy, it looks like the populist movement, at least under Maloney, has sold out sufficiently enough where they can toe the Atlanticist line while having some concessions, even though the few quote-unquote populist concessions you saw in Italy, particularly the migration issue went out the window. Sure, they put some stopper on that. They didn't make the situation look as... They made the situation look better than it was for a while there. They agreed to some quote-unquote remigration agreements. But you're going to keep seeing this among parties and candidates who don't toe the NATO line, who do not toe the Atlanticist line, 100%. Even Le Pen, who you could say in part, or could have been cajoled into towing the Atlanticist line, still receive that scrutiny. I think that does also explain a lot of what we see out of, say, somebody like Farage in the UK. Even though I understand there's a certain disconnect between the UK and continental European politics, where in many ways he has aligned his positions with that of, say, the British establishment, and given up on some of his other populist mores. And I know some people say that not only him, but a lot of these people were sellouts from the start, and I don't necessarily deny that. I think there's a case to be made for that. But we do see as the scrutiny of power comes down on these people, the more they moderate, the more they can quote unquote mainstream their views. To continue on from that, though, with some of the feuding between the U.S. and Russia, well, not the U.S. and Russia right now, even though that does exist, between the U.S. and Europe, the question of Denmark comes up. And beyond maybe a throwaway line in Trump's first term or just a matter of bombastic politics in his second term, it does seem that the U.S., and I never denied this, but it does seem that very explicitly so the U.S. is focused on bringing Denmark under its direct sphere of influence and decoupling it from Europe. Whether that is a direct integration into the U.S. as a state or territory is another question, but they are very pro-independence for Denmark, at the very least, pro-independence from Denmark for Greenland, and the reestablishment of a U.S. military presence in Greenland, particularly when it comes to the Arctic Circle. Vance visited Greenland. He gave a speech to some of the U.S. forces stationed there, laying out the strategic reasons that the administration is pursuing integration of Greenland into a wider North American defense network. Starting out with some antiquated claims about missile launch and missile defense, where it felt like something out of, say, the 60s or 70s, where with ICBM technology, the idea of range is mitigated. Sure, there is some advantage to shorter range missiles. There is lesser response time. There is more of an element of surprise. But when it comes to the kind of nuclear exchange most people think of, the ICBMs are going to negate most advantages. I say not any advantages. Negate most advantages of what, say, an early detection system in the Arctic Circle may provide you. Not to mention we have that in Alaska. Canada, which is explicitly part of NATO, and so is Greenland under Denmark, is also explicitly part of NATO. They would be tied in that network. Trump just, in my opinion, wants more direct control over North America, particularly Canada, and also Greenland to extent for that access to the Arctic Circle and for that access to energy. One of the other claims that Vance made was about mineral extraction, and there were some comments, I suppose, in what one could say a quote-unquote hypothetical sense, that if the situation were dire enough, the United States would be willing to seize Greenland by force, and that if there were hypothetically some greater conflagration with Russia and China that required us to have a greater presence in the Arctic, that Trump has not ruled out military seizure. Once again, how much of this is just Trump blowing hot air versus how much is serious policy? I do think, if not from Trump himself, from somebody in his administration, the idea of this North American fortress is something that they do view as a strategic priority. That is something that they view as the world grows more multipolar. The Americans are going to need more control over their direct region, which means reduced sovereignty for Canada, reduced sovereignty for these leftover European holdings in North America, and that they will be integrated under the American defense umbrella, and that they will be integrated under the American security umbrella, and that the Americans will have free reign to operate in these in both military and economic sense. So, in many ways, I think it's kind of inevitable. I don't think that Trump is going to, for example, tariff Canada into the 51st state or tariff Denmark into giving up Greenland. But there probably is some finer diplomacy taking place behind the scenes. And I'm not saying that there isn't an immense amount of pressure on these countries in order to cooperate with American demands. But I think a lot of people, as usual, and I'm not even necessarily defending it, are reading too much into Trump's rhetoric versus his actual actions. But it has sparked yet another diplomatic row between the Americans and the Europeans at large. And now you have NATO panicking, and this is on top of Trump's remarks towards Greenland, which is, of course, part of Denmark, which is a fellow NATO member, and also in terms of Trump's uncertain positions on Ukraine, where the Europeans are in panic over the U.S. ability to pull the plug on military equipment that they've made themselves overly reliant on. That includes everything from the F-35 aircraft, the MQ-9 Reaper drones, Trident missile systems out of the UK, Patriot missile defenses, as well as other aircraft such as the P-8 Poseidon, the RC-135, the E-7 surveillance planes, the Black Hawk and Apache helicopters, and also the HIMARS missile systems. And this entire time, with this dispute between the US and Europe, none of this has ever led to a greater rethinking. Sure, there's the talk of European rearmament, of strategic ambiguity, of European self-determination, blah, 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 etc., etc., etc. But at the end of the day, whenever you see the European leadership come out with a statement, and like I said, I'm not even necessarily defending Trump's antics. I think in many ways he's being ridiculous. In many ways he's being overbearing. He is understanding the dynamics of the American empire as vassals, whether wittingly or unwittingly. But the European response, I know they don't have much room to work with, has been pathetic. As we always see, they double down on the Americans for being insufficiently American. That we are better liberals than you. We are better war hawks than you. We are better at escalating with Russia than you. And that you need to pick up the slack. Rather than pursuing some sort of independent foreign policy, which in my opinion would necessarily imply some sort of thawing of relations with the Russians. Not that they would necessarily be aligned with the Russians, but some sort of thawing with the Russians. But that's simply not going to happen. But when you get somebody in Europe who is actually willing to address the problem on multiple fronts, that it being Robert Fico, Slovakia's prime minister, who is willing to bring the Ukraine question to a head and ask, what is Europe's goal with Ukraine? Why do we continue to fund this project? But on top of that, also willing to speak directly to Washington and try to open up some channels of negotiations. Like I said, you can say that Trump is being overbearing. You can say Trump is not necessarily even in the right here. That may be the case. But it does seem like there's only a handful of people in Europe who are actually willing to sit down and talk these issues out. So when you have Fico actually getting to talk with Trump about tariffs, about economic issues, Ursula decides to write him off as an idiot. Her words, not mine. And instead of showing initiative, instead of trying to maybe break ground with their security guarantors, and like I said, I'm not even in favor of this very bombastic, brutish, one might say, American behavior towards the Europeans, but when you actually have somebody willing to get to the bottom of this, he gets ostracized by the European political class. And I've said this before in talks about Trump's foreign policy when it comes to America's quote-unquote traditional allies. I do feel some degree of sympathy for the Canadians because they don't have many options or don't really have any other options. But the Europeans continue down a path of self-sabotage. They continue down a path of working directly against their people's own interests, and then still appealing to Washington for more support, for doubling down on the status quo, when if Europe really wanted that strategic ambiguity, if Europe really wanted that independence and global politics that they wanted, while I understand the vast amounts of American influence in Europe, don't get me wrong, they are more than capable of calling the Russians the Chinese, and more than capable of making deals independent from the U.S. Like I said, it would incur the wrath of a great many people in Washington, but if there is somebody brazen enough to go out there, they can make that example. They can set that trend, although I will acknowledge it is a deadly game for anyone willing to play for any of these major European countries. Because if we saw somebody like Orban, as I said previously, in Germany, in France, even somewhere like Italy or Spain at that rate, there would be trumped up political charges to put these people in jail. There'd be assassination attempts. I mean, look, they tried to assassinate Fico, and we're talking about Slovakia. And with all due respect to Slovakia, to my understanding, it's a wonderful nation. I've met a number of wonderful Slovak people, um, both via the internet and via the diaspora. It's not exactly a major player in European politics. In the same case with the Hungarians. They're not exactly a major player in European politics. Now, they have an outsized influence because of the structure of the European Union and also because of the skills of their leadership class, which I can't take away from them. I will give them a great amount of praise for that. But when it comes to directing the course of Europe, it's simply out of their hands. And the Europeans are stuck with these headless chickens who at the same time want to shake their fist at Trump and curse him, but instead of it being for any real reason, instead of it being for their legitimate grievances with the American empire, it's that the American empire is insufficiently serving its role and that they want to return to the status quo. And the most frustrating part about all of this is that if somebody with better optics were in the White House making the same demands as the Europeans, they would be tripping over themselves to acquiesce to those demands. Mind you, Biden committed one of the largest acts of industrial sabotage in history, and Olaf Scholz is awarding him a medal. Pirate Schultz, whatever you want to call him. This clown, this limp-wristed man, is pinning it. Well, excuse me, it wasn't Schultz. It was the president of Germany. Is giving Biden one of the highest honors of the land when this man committed what is arguably an act of war against your country. And I don't know if Trump had blown up Nord Stream in his term or if Trump blows up Turk Stream now. Will we hear about it? Or because it's in the service of a greater geopolitical game, would they be willing to overlook that? But my point isn't that the Europors are all welfare queens and that it's time for America to, swing its Johnson around and be back in charge. My exact point is that the Europeans are not concerned with any of the real issues at hand, just simply optics, and that being the European leadership class. There's plenty of fine Europeans, plenty of sane Europeans out there, many of whom I've spoken to myself, not to invoke too much Trumpian rhetoric, but it is maddening to watch these same people only refuse to sell out their country because the optics aren't good enough. And that's what all of this really boils down to. I see really no other way around it. But for some other minor European news stories before I just make this a piss on the Eurocrats episode, I'll go to some news out of Poland for starters. And that is this new attempt for the military training program for all Polish adult men. I'm not sure whether they've extended that to adult women yet, but it is a system of I guess you could say soft conscription. Maybe I don't want to compare it to the Swiss because it's not similar, but it is a mandate for a significant swath of the Polish population to undergo military training. And the majority of the citizens of Poland do not support this program. They do not want to partake in it. According to a survey from the RMF FM radio station, which is a public opinion poll taken from that, about 54% of the respondents said they had a negative attitude towards the program, with 33% saying they strongly disagreed. Interest in military training was expressed by only 35% of the respondents, among whom 14% said they would actually like to partake in such a system. And this comes after Tusk's announcement in early March that he had announced a plan for a program of military training for civilians on a voluntary basis. Voluntary for now, I suppose. According to him, such a program could be prepared within the next few weeks. So Tusk is preparing for war. And Tusk is also one of these European politicians who has played coy with Trump, who has tried to get on his good side. And he was actually talking about how Poland meets its NATO spending requirements and how the U.S. invests so much in Poland, how it's such an invaluable and indispensable part of the American security infrastructure in Europe. And at this point, Tusk, knowing him, knowing his game, he's trying to court more American money to Poland. Insofar as America is going to maintain a presence in Europe, he wants that to shift from command in Germany, in other parts of Western Europe, and he wants Poland to be the American base of operations in Europe, especially vis-a-vis Russia. So he has a vested interest in that. And out of all the European politicians, he was one of the ones who was sent over either right before or right after the inauguration in order to cajole Trump on the Ukraine issue. He was with Macron, and I think also Olaf Scholz was there as well, with a few other these generic European politicians. But more interestingly, to return to Hungary, Peter Szijjártó, foreign minister, made some interesting statements regarding just general EU plans. To touch on what we were talking about earlier with Ukraine's EU membership, that Hungary would block Ukraine's EU accession due to particularly the situation of the ethnic Hungarian minority and their treatment by the Kiev government. To quote Szijjártó, despite constant promises and fine words, the Ukrainian government has not restored minority rights which were taken away from the Hungarian community since 2015. And he also continued on with a more scathing criticism of Ukraine, saying that it considers strikes on energy infrastructure through which Budapest receives the Russian energy sources as an attack on its sovereignty. Szijjártó was speaking to RIA Novosti, the Russian media outlet, about this, and he said that was an issue in the recent weeks and months, that the Ukrainian attacks the Druzhba pipeline and its connecting infrastructure as an outcome which on a couple of occasions we had disruption in oil deliveries, even for entire days. He was openly supportive of Trump's attempt for the energy ceasefire and saying that it, noting that it included energy infrastructure through which Russian oil and gas are delivered to Hungary. Quote, we also were informed by the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on that time that the Russian Air Force or air protection had prevented a Turk Stream infrastructure from a drone attack starting from Ukraine. So, as I'd mentioned previously, we also do see attacks towards Turk Stream, and that is probably the next target if there's going to be a major industrial sabotage by the usual suspect. But he did go on further to say, probably one of the more interesting quotes from his interview, is that Europe faced no external military or security threat when the question of NATO came up and when the question of the European Union urging its citizens and its nations to prepare a 72-hour emergency plan for food and resource access. So the standard saber rattling from the European Union, I suppose you could guess, but Szijjártó was very resolute in saying that no, it's not the case. It doesn't matter. This is more or less a hoax, I guess you could say. But to continue on with some further news out of Europe, moving on to Serbia, Vucic and Orban have held talks agreeing to further military cooperations and defense, and this comes after their initial agreement to counter the alliance of Croatia, Albania, Kosovo, and possibly Bulgaria in order to offset quote unquote Serbia in the region, which wasn't their official statement, but that's what it effectively was. And then the Hungarians, on top of sending special police to support the provision, not provisional, but the provincial government, I suppose you could say, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Republika Srpska, upon the illegal troubles with Dodik, have furthered their ties with Serbia and have entered into a framework of security agreements with them. And now you have the Hungarians who are possibly putting themselves at odds with fellow NATO members in support of Serbia. So you are seeing this region. I know Hungary isn't technically in the Balkans, but this region of Central Europe into the Balkans becoming much more of a hotspot than it was in previous years. And as we've discussed on previous episodes, once again, if the Americans, or if by extent the British, looking to draw the Americans back into Europe, wanted to ignite another flashpoint, it does look like this might be the place, especially with some of the politics coming out of Bosnia, with the on and off issues with Kosovo, with the military buildup in Romania. I know that's mainly postured towards Russia, but it very easily could be turned towards focus in the Balkans if needed. And also, that's also with the political instability in Turkey. We don't know what direction that's going to go in and what kind of response that would necessitate for the American empire. But to continue on with Serbia, the deputy prime minister of Serbia, Alexander Vulin, in an interview told with Sputnik, said that Serbia would not join NATO or the CSTO, pledging neutrality. Serbia, you see with its policy right now, particularly with its position towards the European Union, the United States, as well as Russia and China, is trying to position itself as one of those middlemen countries. And we've seen the results for good and for ill, and one might argue that the current unrest there, while I don't doubt that some, if not quite a bit of it, is organic, that a lot of it is the regime change apparatus capitalizing on a pre-existing situation, as we've seen many times before. To keep in the region, or relatively within the region, Moldova has cracked down on the autonomous parts of Gaguzia, which are the Turkic people who live in Moldova. They're not Muslim, by the way. They actually are majority Christian, which I thought was interesting just as a small demographic note. And that Evgenia Gutzel, who is the head of the region, has been jailed for 20 days. And in response, you have seen a number of protests in Moldova in support of her, as you have the Moldovan government, which already had its shaky election a few months back, if you recall, as well as the referendum for EU accession, or the referendum establishing interest in EU accession, whatever layers they want to hide it behind. And following the pattern of, I know Moldova is not in the European Union or NATO, but following the pattern of Romania, of Turkey, of France, you're seeing them crack down on domestic political opponents, and that's also on top of a precarious ethnic situation. And I know there hasn't been much concrete action, but they have had their sights on Pridnestrovye, on Transnistria, if you will. Now that it has been cut off from Ukraine, I know that there was speculation the Ukrainians were going to go in for their own special military operation in Pridnestrovye, as well as talks of Romania and Moldova launching a joint operation in order to more or less end the separatist republic. But it doesn't seem like any concrete action has been taken thus far to cut off Transnistria, to cut off Pridnestrovye. And in fact, because of the energy cutoffs at the beginning of this year, the Russians actually are providing them, I believe at this point, still free energy as well. And if I'm not mistaken, that route does come through Turkstream, but Moldova could be the next country that unravels. And for years, I suppose, been speculated why integration with Romania is not on the agenda. And I do understand that, yes, we had brought up the two issues of Pridnestrovia, Transnistria, and the Gaguzia regions. But barring that, it does seem logically for NATO as far as the West is concerned, and I know that Romania would have to bear the cost of that, and perhaps the European Union could pick up a bit of the bill if they did do that. With reintegration into Romania, it seems like the next logical move, barring some of the outstanding issues. And if there isn't some sort of major upheaval in Moldova soon, I don't particularly see it surviving as an independent state. And it seems like what was once a relatively stable post Soviet country tends to slip further and further into chaos as time goes on, and as we've seen in many cases. But one of the last pieces of European news I'll leave you with, last couple pieces of news. I'll start with the pipeline proposal out of Bulgaria. And Bulgaria will begin constructing a new pipeline linking Greek LNG terminals to Romania, Moldova, Hungary, and Slovakia. And this is a new gas corridor, and these LNG particularly come from Qatar, from the Gulf states. And it's the called the Vertical Gas Corridor, and it's a joint venture between Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Ukraine, Moldova, and Slovakia. And it's to quote unquote advance energy security and diversify gas supplies. A total of 4,000 pipes were transported from India through the Red Sea, the Bulgarian energy minister noted, and that the transportation of pipes to the country's interior is underway. All necessary pipes for the new gas pipeline are expected to be delivered by the 20th of April. So we'll see if this project actually takes off. Once again, you do see these minor energy projects cropped up in Europe, but none of them really ever seem to be enough or convenient enough to displace Russian energy interests. So we'll see how this actually alleviates the energy burden in Europe. I think the jury's still out on it, and it might provide some relief, but it's not going to make up for the loss of being cut off from the Russian markets. But the last and somewhat bizarre story I have out of Europe are these U.S. troops, I believe 6 confirmed dead now, as well as their vehicle that was recovered, who were found dead in the swamplands between Lithuania and Belarus. And you could chalk this up to perhaps they were drunk or under the influence of some substance, drove their vehicle into a swampland that was, of course, on guard because it's swampland, and eventually perished there. You could say it's a bit more nefarious that that's a cover story, that they were running some sort of operation or some sort of probing mission regarding Belarus and were discovered and were liquidated. But it's one of those stories I don't think we're ever going to get the full details on. And just the question of disappearing into the swamp, never to be seen again, doesn't quite sit right with me. I don't have too much on the story, but I want to bring it up for just the sake of record and something that we can return to at some point. But much more substantially, we do have a fair bit of news out of the Middle East. So in Turkey, Imamoglu was arrested, and protesters have taken to the streets, and we're talking probably a good couple million protesters in Istanbul alone. So when it comes to Erdogan's political prospects, and we were speculating about this last episode, what was the greater move at play here? Frankly, I'm not quite sure. Even today, I'm not quite sure. And this could be a move that backfires, and that if there is anyone who wants to capitalize on a color revolution, now I know Trump and Erdogan have a good working relationship, but if I don't know, some document from the State Department, the Pentagon, or whoever comes up getting Trump to greenlight on this, saying that Turkey could become a much more cooperative ally in the event of regime change, in the event that they're able to get rid of Erdogan, put somebody a little bit more reliably pro-Western there, you might get that situation. And also considering that Turkey and Israel are coming to a head and that they are starting to clash, having somebody of, say, a less Islamic persuasion, more of a Kemalist persuasion, as Imamoglu is, might be beneficial, might be able to be enough to convince them to ease up on Israel. However, once again, secularization in terms on a social level has been rolled back a great degree in Turkey. Not entirely, especially compared to some of its neighbors, some of its contemporaries in the wider Muslim world, but it's been rolled back a great deal. So, in terms of convincing the population to have even just a mutual understanding with Israel, that might be a bit of a stretch, but time will tell with that. I am curious to see if Erdogan can grasp on the power. For now, it doesn't seem like that much of a threat. If these protests can be sustained at such large numbers, then I will start to question his political future and start to question the future of his successors, as well as his personal health, his personal situation, seeing how he reacts, how, I suppose, vital he is in the face of a potential coup, a potential challenge to his power. But it is a developing situation nonetheless, one that does capture my interest. So we will certainly keep an eye on that. But getting into some more substantial news in the Middle East before we get too much into the Iran buildup, and that is starting with Israel Palestine. So on March 27th, it was confirmed there was a drone strike carried out on Hezbollah elite forces, particularly Ahmed Adrian Bajija, who was a battalion commander of Hezbollah, and the IDF released the footage claiming the kill on him. There was also a renewal of strikes against targets within Gaza, which had a great deal of collateral damage, if that's what you want to call it. But in retaliation, we have seen the Houthis continue their missile barrage into Israel, with some success. It doesn't seem like the Israeli interception system is what it once was. It doesn't seem like the myth of the Iron Dome and David Sling is really holding up as well as it used to. But in all of this, you have renewed calls from Qatar and Egypt for a ceasefire, leading to a much more, I guess you could say, even-handed agreement, because Israel seems to be quite absolutist, and that in response to some of the proposals coming from the U.S., coming from the West, that the Egyptians and the Qataris have come up with their own counteroffer, at least to keep the status quo, at least to stop the Gaza Lago program from coming to fruition, even though how serious that ever was, I'm not sure. However, on that note, Netanyahu's government is allegedly in resettlement talks for the Palestinian populations to send them to Indonesia, Sudan, or Somalia. That's about as unhinged as it sounds. I don't think that would ever come to fruition. And I don't think they're getting this mass expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza unless they do it by direct force. If they were going to cajole them into leaving, at this point they would have. But as it stands now, I simply don't see it happening. Nor do I think these countries would necessarily be the first to agree to it. But getting on to probably the most important Middle Eastern news, and that is the Signal chat leak. And I'll go ahead and pull this up. This was in regard to the lead up to the strikes on the Houthis in Yemen. So I'll go ahead and put these on screen. And this was a chat from several members of Trump's administration, his Security Council included Vance, Hegseth, National Security Advisor Walls, as well as other figures like Ratcliffe, head of the CIA, I think Tulsi Gabbard, and then just various their staffers were in there. So this is just a cross section of uh, what was discussed in these chats. So they were discussing at first the effects on the shipping and the trade. Vance said, if you think we should do it, let's do it. I just hate bailing Europe out again. Vance expressed a more restrained view of this, saying that was bad timing. Uh, Looking to involve in the Middle East was not going to help the administration's current goals. But he was ultimately, of course, Trump's call, and Trump made that call. So Hegseth said, I fully share loathing European freeloading. It's pathetic, all caps. But Mike is correct, Mike being Mike Waltz. And this is the chat, just for reference, that they had at Atlantic journalist Jeffrey Goldberg, too, former IDF soldier. So, I mean, the entire Goldberg scandal was. I'll get into it. It was bizarre, to say the least. Um, but Mike is correct. We're the only ones on the planet on our side of the ledger who can do this. Nobody else is even close, questioning his timing. I feel like now is a good time as any, given POTUS directed to reopen shipping lanes. I think we should go, but POTUS still retains 24 hours decision space. Going on to one of the other members of the chat. As I heard, the president was clear green light, but soon make it clear to Egypt and Europe what we expect in return. We also need to figure out how to enforce such a requirement, e.g., if Europe doesn't remunerate. Sorry, it's getting late. I'm getting a little tired recording some of this. Even though I cut it out, I just read through that New York Times article that took like an hour to get through. So apologies if there's anything botched here. If the U.S. successfully restores freedom of navigation at great cost, there needs to be some further economic gain extraction in return. Hegseth says agreed. Vance says excellent. Radcliffe says good start. Waltz is using emojis like he's a 6-year-old boomer. Fist American flag fire. Good job, Pete, and your team. Wallace, the team in MAL did a great job, great work, powerful start. And this is them. And there's more details about when the strikes took place and the exact plans for it. And the leaks themselves, I have to say, aren't very exciting. This is typical foreign policy chatter, just the fact that some army journalists got added in and leaked it, and it became much bigger story than what it was. And I'm not excusing this. I, of course, don't support the military actions of Yemen. I think it's ridiculous, the entire situation. And that could be easily remedied if we would just tug the leash ever so slightly in Israel. But, of course, that's never going to happen. But it was painted as some unique security breach by the Trump administration, as if it was some unique degree of incompetence, where I think probably going back for the past several administrations, you would get this kind of behavior. Putting in Signal, which is an unsecured chat line, which I believe actually, if I recall correctly, was originally a Russian company, and of course due to the sanctions they had to rearrange their U.S. affiliate, but that has some very strange strategic implications. If that actually was a Russian platform, assuming that whoever in Russia might still have some sort of backdoor access to it. But once you notice that you never see these kind of leaks anywhere else, because it seems like the rest of the world outside of the modern West is capable of practicing proper OPSEC and not adding random journalists. And some might say this was deliberate, some might say this was story, but I think there was generally a breakdown in competence in this particular scenario. Even though one theory I personally like is that there's just so many damn Jeffrey Goldbergs out there in the foreign policy sphere that they added the wrong one, which is the theory I personally choose to believe. But ever since then, it's become a media circus, and like I said, well, I don't think this was best form. I don't think this is damning. Although Trump is standing by everyone in the chat, I think it would do him well to at least make a sacrifice, throw somebody on the bus, maybe Waltz, excuse me, or one of these other minor foreign policy talking heads on his team that he can easily dispose of. As we know from Trump's first term, his cabinet always had a high rate of turnover. This isn't anything, and make somebody take the responsibility for it. Make somebody resign. I don't think as high profile as Hegseth is a politically prudent move, or even somebody as high profile as the National Security Advisor is a prudent move, but they need a fall guy in order to make the situation go away. And some might say that doubling down, that thumbing their nose at the media is the best approach, and I can sympathize with that. But in order to satiate the circus, I think that they might just need to lick their wounds on this one, take the L, and move on. But much more interestingly, we have the standoff between the U.S. and Iran, and the speculation of American strikes in Iran as Trump's quote unquote 2 month deadline for the Iranians to come to the negotiating table comes to a close. So I'll go ahead and put up a map of Diego Garcia and its range to Iran, because this is the Indian Ocean base that the U.S. is operating out of for this military buildup, and it is quite a substantial buildup. This does seem like more than just a saber rattling technique, and the Iranians, to their own part, have been increasing their posturing with their missiles. And as it stands now, Diego Garcia is about 5,000 kilometers or 3,000 miles from the U.S. base in Iran, and Diego Garcia are about 5,000 kilometers, 3,000 miles apart, which the Iranian missiles certainly have the range to hit, and also American long-range aircraft also have the range to hit Iran, respectively. And that's on top of the naval assets just in the Persian Gulf and in the region in general. And at this point, it does look like a pretty significant military buildup. I'm not going to deny that, and I'm not going to deny that there is a desire to at least conduct some sort of a strike on Iran. And the speculation is, are they going to do some sort of decapitation strike where they take out several key political and military figures in order to make the Iranians do a headless chicken? Is it going to be a strategic strike against missile strikes, nuclear facilities, with the concern that the Iranians may pursue a nuclear bomb? Or what is ultimately going to be the outcome of this is, of course, what everyone's wondering. Now, the recent news we have is that Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Qatar have refused their air bases to a U.S. strike against the Iranians. And these are all nations that, even just 10 years ago, would have been banging for blood at the Iranians and ginning up their own populations to get ready for the next jihad against the Shia infidel, or however you want to say it. But as it stands now, the Gulf states, which all have had their own form of reconciliation with the Iranians, are much more hesitant to give the green light to this sort of operation. And at this point, no, I don't think there's going to be U.S. strike. I think the Pentagon wants it. I think Trump wants it. I think Trump teams wants it. But it's simply not within the realm of possibility. I don't think anyone believes, for example, what Witkov was claiming, that the Iranians have no air defense left to speak of. No, they have. At this point, they probably have S-400s at this, and if they don't, the Russians would be willing to provide it. Russia and China have every strategic reason to bail out the Iranians in the event of an American attack. I'm not talking about direct involvement, but they could reverse the situation that we saw in Ukraine, where if the Americans do decide to engage in direct military confrontation with the Iranians, the Russians and the Chinese are more than capable of funding the Iranians and providing them with a deal of strategic arms that can hit back at the U.S., particularly when it comes to tying them down in the Middle East as they both pursue their interests elsewhere. And that's not to say Iran would just be a sacrifice in interest of fighting the Americans. As I had mentioned previously in the episode, it is a key player in the Russian trade routes heading to the east and heading to Africa, where this is what spills out into the sea. This is how the Russians particularly trade with the Indians, who have become a vital trading partner, especially post 2022, and also a great number of Iranian oil ships head east, not only to China, but to South Korea and Japan, to U.S. allies, to U.S. vassal states, if you will. And also, military activity in the region would disrupt the rest of the Gulf states that are still on relatively good terms with the U.S. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, Kuwait. Once again, the aforementioned countries that are refusing to let the U.S. use their military infrastructure for any sort of strike on Iran. And while I do think the will is there, while I do think that build on Diego Garcia, which I think is, at this point, I know it's right now in talks between the British, handing over the island to the locals, to self-governance, to one of the nearby countries. I can't quite remember whose sovereignty would pass under, but point being, either way, the U.S. base would remain. And that's why you see the build up there, in my opinion, is because the Gulf states won't go along with this. And I think they are gearing up for some sort of action against Iran, whether that's hard power, whether that's soft power. I couldn't quite tell you, but Iran has been in their crosshair for a number of years. It is the weakest link of the, I guess you could say, growing anti collective West, anti American Empire alliance. And on top of all of that, Israel feels threatened by them, so therefore we must act in Israel's defense in order to bring the Iranians down to size. Now, like I said, a lot of people say this is a negotiating tactic. A lot of people say this is to get them to the table to recreate a deal that we tore up 8 years ago under Trump. But I do think it probably is genuinely posturing for a military action. Now, once again, how sustained such an action will be, I don't know. I hope it wouldn't be sustained. I hope it wouldn't happen in the first place. But then there's also the practical considerations of, can they afford to do this? Can they afford to tie down the resources even in a temporary war with the Iranians? I think that at this point, while they would like to believe it's setting up for a genuine military attack, while they would want to carry it out, at this point it effectively just is posturing. And they know they cannot afford to engage in any real military conflict with the Iranians. But I hope I'm right about that. I hope it doesn't escalate to a point where we are embroiled in another full scale Middle Eastern war, because it would be a disaster. But at this point, I think the Iranians have proper deterrence to prevent such an attack. We've seen the capability of Iranian missiles. Think back to 2019, 2020, where they could hit targets in Syria and Iraq, which are much shorter range, admittedly, and hit U.S. targets and not receive a response. And that was under Trump's first administration. I remember the attacks in retaliation for Soleimani. They claimed concussions and headaches. They were very eager to cover up the Iranian counterattacks for those. And while they weren't as flashy and as much of a spectacle as some people would maybe like to see, they still did take place, and the Iranians still did show that they are a formidable military force, and that this isn't Saddam Hussein's Iraq in 2003. This isn't any of the other weak regimes that they toppled, and that despite internal issues in Iran, militarily speaking, they are still formidable. And I think that it isn't just about bluff, it isn't just about negotiation, but there is a genuine deterrence established, but they understand at this point they cannot topple Iran militarily. Now we'll see what they can conduct through other means, or we'll see if they are actually willing to commit the time, effort, and resources to such an arduous campaign. But I'll believe when I see it. Now, all on that same note, Trump's first foreign visit is slated in mid-May to go to Saudi Arabia. Much like his first term, because that was also his first visit abroad during his first term, was going to Saudi Arabia, Israel, and actually the Palestinian Authority as well. A lot of different times, seems like. But what I would imagine on the surface, a lot of people will say this is to continue on with the U.S.-Russia talks. And I do think that is part of it, that Trump wants to meet with the negotiating team in Saudi Arabia, and maybe even some of the Russian officials in Saudi Arabia. Not to mention, of course, we're talking about a strategically vital country for the American empire. And I think in relation to the standoff with the Iranians, Trump is going to try to revive an old idea that we saw in his first term, and that is the Abraham Accords and Arab NATO, establishing a network of anti-Iranian Arab countries into a defensive network secured by the U.S., while also leaning on them to normalize relations, even in a backdoor sense, with the Israelis. So we'll see how successful he'll be, but I think that is almost certainly going to be his agenda for his first visit abroad. That Russia Ukraine definitely going to be a part of it, and he's going to want to meet with certainly his negotiating team, if not some of the Russian delegates. But ultimately, I think it's going to be trying to convince the Arab world back into its anti-Iranian posturing that it held before 2021, 2022. And we've said it many times before. I stand by the statement. The American empire has neither a carrot nor a stick to offer to these countries to get them to cooperate, and they have no real diplomatic levers, because these are countries that have been courted by Russia and China for a number of years now. They realize that they're not solely reliant on the Americans, and that the Americans over the past decade, even going back before Trump, have blown a lot of their diplomatic credibility. And there are now other options, and it's not going to be as easy as it was even just 8 years ago to fly out to the Gulf states, who were at that point all pretty solidly pro-American, or pro-American empire at least, and convince them that we need a maximum pressure campaign on the Iranians. We need the Iranian government to depart, especially when you've had such monumental diplomatic breakthroughs, brokered by China, mind you, between Saudi Arabia and Iran. You're not going to overdo that overnight. You're probably not going to undo that over the course of several years, especially as American power wanes and Chinese power, especially economic power, continues to maintain and grow. But speaking of China, the last topic I really wanted to cover for today was some interesting news out of the Asia Pacific. And I know, once again, this is a region, because news items are much slower out of this part of the world, it tends to get overlooked. I always like to try to return to it. But probably the biggest news in quite some time out of this, when it comes to beyond, say, North Korean missiles, beyond, say, tensions between China and Japan, or some of the islands in the South China Sea, or disputes between China and Vietnam, when it comes to substantial diplomatic shifts, we are seeing a revival of the trilateral talks between South Korea, China, and Japan. And this is the first economic dialogue summit they've held in 5 years. Now, 5 years ago would have been Trump still in office, and this is in response to the tariffs. This is in response to Trump's trade war policies, and we saw this in his first term, where the Japanese and the Chinese, who of course do not have good diplomatic relations, are very hostile towards each other, were able to reach a common understanding if the Americans are to pursue this economic policy, to pursue this tariff policy, in order to, quote unquote, make these countries pay their fair share, or pay back what they owe the Americans. Once again, I've gone over my thoughts on Trump's tariffs policy. I think that there's some merit to it in principle, but in execution, I think it leaves a lot to be desired, and also leaves me questioning the logic behind it. But this is something else we've talked about on the show for a number of years. While there are those tensions in East Asia, I don't want to downplay those. I'm not going to say these countries get along. I'm not going to say these countries have good relations. But because China, in particular, is such an economic titan, and because Japan and South Korea have strong economies themselves, economic pragmatism has taken a front seat over a lot of the other security and geopolitical concerns. That China is simply too valuable a partner to be on a hostile footing with. And you see that with the return of these sort of talks, which I think is funny. Amid this, you have Trump talking about how he wants to reestablish contact with North Korea and resume negotiations regarding the Korean Peninsula again. So I guess Trump found his true ally in the East, and that is Chairman Kim. I don't know, maybe Mongolia will turncoat. I know that Trump had good experiences in Mongolia and with the Mongolian leadership in his first term, but Mongolia seems to be pretty comfortable wedged right between Russia and China. It's a very comfortable position to be in when I think somebody once called it an infinite money glitch because they're right there, they're right on all the trade routes, they're perfect positioning for any pipeline or energy deals. But I don't know, maybe Trump will find his true alliance in Chairman Kim. But in all seriousness, with the diplomatic developments between South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, assuming Trump's tariffs actually have teeth to them, this isn't something he's going to waffle back and forth on over the next 3 weeks and eventually decide to implement some either very mild version or completely back out at all. I'm not saying these countries, once again, I want to clarify, I'm not saying these countries will have good relations with each other, but you'll see a lot more economic cohesion in East Asia that is to the exclusion of the US. And as economic ties improve, so may diplomatic relations. Not necessarily, but you might see a some diplomatic breakthroughs between these three countries, particularly South Korea and Japan vis-a-vis China. And as that happens, American forces in the region may be seen as more of a hindrance than a guarantee of security. In which case you could see, I don't know, maybe a Japanese color revolution, maybe a South Korean color revolution. I mean, the coup attempt at the end of last year in South Korea was a bizarre enough story on its own. And I do think that when related to these kind of policies, it is something worth considering. What is American influence in the region? How much power do they have to stage regime change in either Japan or South Korea? I mean, China is locked down pretty tight. I don't think we're going to see anything different out of that. Or how much ability do they have to foment, say, conflict between South Korea and North Korea? I know that Trump likes to tout his relationship with Kim Jong Un and wants to talk about resuming those negotiations, but if strategic interests call for it, they can inflame the situation on the Korean Peninsula if they do need some excuse for military buildup. So it becomes a precarious situation if the Chinese and the Japanese and the South Koreans can establish some sort of mutual cooperation. Like I said, not even good relations, but some sort of more comprehensive cooperation than what currently exists. You could see the Americans iced out in another region, which would, I suppose, at that point, would give them all the more reason to double down in the Middle East and double down on the issue of Iran. And not only with the tariffs, I do think that when it comes to energy trade, as I had mentioned before, a lot of East Asian energy, not only to China but to Japan and South Korea, comes from Iran, comes from the Gulf states, comes from that trading route, and that a disruption in that would be hell on their economies, which are already having their own issues. I mean, the Japanese, I think, are technically in a recession right now. But it is worth noting, beyond Trump, these summits usually take months in advance to plan. I suppose they may have had knowledge that Trump was returning to office. They started planning this November onward. That this does seem indicative of wider trends, but I do think Trump is accelerating these. And it will be interesting to see how this plays out. And they did actually, I mean, they held their first summit, which was business as usual, I suppose. But in terms of progress going forward, it will be interesting to see if they are able to sustain these economic summits. They are able to sustain stronger trade relations with each other. I mean, already we're talking about uh, one of, if not the largest trading partner of, I know for a fact Japan. I'm not sure about South Korea. I would imagine much the same. Is China, and they are becoming an undeniably powerful force in the world. It's not something that you can just ignore. It's not something you can write off. It's not something you can say China collapses in 20 years, American century remains strong. That even despite some of the problems on the horizon, China will continue to be economic bastion. I don't think that they're going to displace the U.S. as a superpower, so to speak. Number one, I don't think they're in a position to. Number two, I don't even think that's necessarily the desire. They're much more focused on trade and commerce, at least for the time being. But it's becoming undeniable that China is not simply a country that can be that you can wag your finger at and have them fall into line, or it's not a country that is still. I mean, I suppose you could look at some of the socioeconomic situation in China and say it is quote unquote developing, but on a grand scale, this is no longer the country that it was, say, in 1990 or 2000. It is a real force to be reckoned with, and even its neighbors, which have taken a traditionally aggressive footing towards it, are starting to come around on that. Now, that's all I had for this episode. Hopefully, we can have GSP back soon, but I hope you guys enjoyed just my solo coverage of some of this stuff, and I'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.